Welcome to the Polysite Podcast. This is your host, Anthony Lindsay.
And Stephanie Marino.
We're here with David Goodwin. So, Steph, you have some questions for him.
Yes. Hello, David.
Hi, how are you?
All right. So my first question to you is, you wrote a book called Left Bank of the Hudson about the gentrification of Jersey City, where artists essentially got pushed out after building the art scene up over there. Can you give me the history on like what happened and how did they end up there and how did they get pushed out?
Sure. So the community I wrote about was community artists living in a building with the address of 111 First Street. And this building was the former factory and warehouse of the P. Lillard Tobacco Company. And if you want later, we can talk a little bit about that company. But in the late 1980s, artists, writers, and other creative folk were feeling the pinch of living in Manhattan, which that hasn't changed. And they began looking for cheaper housing and more sort of affordable options for them to work and live. And this building was marketed to artists in Jersey City, starting in the late 80s. So artists began gravitating towards this building, 1987, 1988, depending on whom you ask. And up until 2005, this building was the center of the arts community and the arts world in Jersey City, New Jersey, which for your listeners who don't know where Jersey City is, it's right across the river from Manhattan. Really is, like a stone's throw away. And as these stories seem to have unfolded throughout our country, when the real estate prices rose, the pressures began to be placed upon the artists to leave the building. And after several years of tussling with the building's owner, the building's management, and the city itself, they were evicted in 2005, and the building was torn down in 2007.
Wow. How were they able to establish an art scene all by themselves out there?
Well, really what you had happening at that time, and really in the late 80s and early 90s, is you had sort of a nascent art scene in Jersey City and earlier in Hoboken, New Jersey, which is the next town over. Mm-hmm. And the artists were living in this building, and just to give you sort of a sense of the size and the scope of the building, it was roughly 200,000 square feet. Oh. And there were 200 artists living and working and or living in this building. They weren't all living in the building. Mm-hmm. And it was almost a self-contained arts community or utopia, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And it became the center of the art scene in Jersey City in the 90s. So in the 90s, you had really a local art scene beginning to percolate in Jersey City. And the centerpiece of this art scene was the annual studio tour. And the annual studio tour was anchored in 111 First Street. And it was the largest concentration of artists, really one of the largest on the East Coast at that time. I heard it was the largest compared to Westbeth in Manhattan, which is artist housing in what is now Greenwich Village. But how did they grow? It was really organic, honestly. The building, as I mentioned, was marketed exclusively to artists originally, and like produces like. So a few artists moved there. They told their friends and acquaintances. They moved there, and it really became this, really self-contained community where art of any kind was creative. From painting to woodworking to filmmaking to fashion, music, dance. Really, you could walk through these halls and find anything and everything going on at any time.
I want to visit. I would have wanted to go through there. I'm not particularly an artist myself. I don't have anything to contribute, but I have a great love and appreciation for all different
kind of soak it in. It would have been awesome to walk through that building and see what the heck is going on. You know what it kind of reminds me of is the Jacobian building. Remember that book we read? I want to say 2 years ago, where they talked about it was an Egyptian building, and literally every square foot of it, every inch of it, it had another family in it. It was packed to the gills with families in Egypt, poor families, and down to the roof itself had a lot of people make makeshift houses up there. They put up whatever walls they could, and it was 15 families living on the roof, and they all had businesses and stuff. They would have a clothes washing business, or it was just what we'd call live, baby. Yeah. It it was so much stuff going on. I imagine that's how this one was.
Oh yeah, where was that building you mentioned in Egypt?
Yeah, in Egypt, it's called the Jacobian building. Jacobin building, where it was like people making makeshift houses out of what was supposed to be just a regular like apartment building, and they like all had businesses and stuff, so you could literally walk down the halls and here's the babysitting, here's where you get your clothes washed, and here's where everyone gambles. Like it was just
that's fascinating.
Yeah, it almost did a kind of a cool but not
slum.
It was just an interesting like structure, because in the lower floors there were the really large apartments where more well-off people rented and rented the whole room, the whole suite. And then as you went like up the floors, things started getting a little bit more like smaller and cheaper and
makeshift.
Yeah, because like in the higher floors where the laundry room and the like janitor's closets and stuff, where people like someone lived in the janitor's closet. So yeah, it was amazing.
It was really a microcosm of a society in many ways.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
exactly what Egypt was like.
That was a very good example, Anthony, because that's what this building kind of sounds like it was in a better way, though. Like, less
slum-like, less Brazilian favela-ish.
A little more like community involvement there.
Yes, it was more more community, more communal. I think that's a good way to describe it.
Nice.
So it was like
some of the people whom I interviewed mentioned that as well. They said it was like a self-contained community where it could function almost in isolation from the surrounding neighborhood, the surrounding city. And it might have been that was probably an exaggeration though, but it's a nice ideal.
Yeah. I can see how that would make the property values freaking skyrocket. I mean, it's like the hipster movement before the hipster movement actually came to be.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that is what happened. And this area of Jersey City was an industrial area. Today, it's known as the Powerhouse Arts District, but there are no arts there. And it was just about 11 to 12 block area of old warehouses, small, light industrial buildings. And really what happened is you had the waterfront in Jersey City, which was being developed. So this is right in the Hudson River, so you can imagine how valuable that is. And then a neighborhood of Jersey City a little further inland, which is known as the downtown area, but is sort of typical brownstone neighborhoods when you think of Sesame Street or parts of Brooklyn or Boston or Philadelphia. And this area was sandwiched between the two of them. So all of a sudden, really after September 11th, you had much more investment flowing in. And then all of a sudden, all this property, all these warehouses became very desirable for redevelopment. And 111 was, unfortunately, part of that phenomenon.
So is this happening in major cities everywhere? And what specifically do you call to blame for this?
Certainly cities are becoming more and more desirable, especially for those with educations, with resources, with means. So, I mean, we could call that gentrification, and that's the term that's bandied about. So, yes, so this phenomenon is happening really from coast to coast across the United States right now. Big cities, small cities. It may only be in certain neighborhoods in the city. You could argue there's a few things going on. I think that's a fair way to address it. I mean, one, it's really what people are desiring. As I mentioned, cities, after decades of disinvestment and sort of being maligned in the media at large and the public imagination at large, are really, becoming desirable for, younger people, retirees, the college-educated, people with more disposable income. And, admittedly, it's not as if no one ever lived in the cities, as we know. I mean, there were always populations in American cities. So you have just really a consumer demand, if you want to call it that, but also in larger cities, places like New York, San Francisco, Washington, so sort of the cities that are really the global cities of the United States, you have massive investment dollars flowing in, massive rezoning of cities. So really changing the landscape of the cities, really changing the entry points as far as who could live in cities.
Yeah.
So what you have in, so places like Jersey City or New York City or San Francisco is all of a sudden all the housing is being constructed for the very affluent.
So,
but not middle class, not working class, not the poor.
So I've noticed that, especially in California, that they had their property values shoot up because there were a lot of foreigners, specifically from the Middle East, from Asia, specifically China and Russia, who would come over and pay for housing in cash. They would just buy it outright. So it made it so that why would I go through an American who has to go through all of the mortgage process, who's going to try to negotiate? If I could sell my house for $1 million to an American, but I could sell it for $1.5 million to an immigrant, like why wouldn't I sell it for $1.5 million? So the property values have like shot through the roof. And it's made it almost there are people here who can't actually afford California anymore. And these aren't even people who are working at Walmart. They haven't been able to get to California in quite a while. But like the people who were considered affluent are like, you know what, this isn't possible anymore because there are cash buyers like waiting to purchase a thing that like, again, I can't afford it anymore. So I wonder, is gentrification like a natural phenomenon where like the people are displaced by outsiders like fairly easily, like if they have more money or they're not already established, like if the artists haven't already bought the building, then someone has the opportunity to come and scoop it up from under them. Like that seems like capitalism 101. Like I have the capital, I win.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I'm arguing in my book. Really, that's one of the considerations artists or really any group needs to take into account is that we live in a society based upon, as you pointed out, private property. So if I own a home or a building, it's in my interest to sell to who's going to offer me the greatest amount. You can't. I couldn't fault a private homeowner for wanting to do that. So in this case, in my book, Left Bank of the Hudson, the building the artist lived in, there were points when they were attempting to purchase it. There were rumors that the owner offered them buyouts, which they could have pooled their resources and bought a different building, maybe not necessarily the building they worked and lived in, 111 First Street. So, one thing I think any group needs to really think about is if they're noticing the changes in their neighborhood, in their city of gentrification, is to figure out how to have some control over the contours of that and the way it unfolds. And really the easiest way is purchasing real estate. And unfortunately, that's often out of the range of the most, shall we say, marginalized or imperiled population in the sense of the artists, where they may not have access to really large amounts of capital. They may not have the finances to purchase property. But that's really for the first way to combat gentrification is to root yourself in the sense of having the way to buy an apartment, buy a home. But as you pointed out, places like California, or places like Washington or New York, that's becoming increasingly impossible for most people, not just as you said, people that are working hourly jobs at Walmart or the service industry, but people that have comfortable middle class income. And you're based out of California? Is this where your show was from?
Oh no, we're based in Charlotte, North Carolina, and
Charlotte. Yeah, that's what I saw on your website. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah, and we I'm sure that we're maybe 5-10 years away from this area becoming too expensive to live in. I think it'll be the East Coast. It'll be another New York City.
Yeah, we already have areas where we have like one particular area where we kind of just don't go there. I mean, it's not bad. It's like the opposite of the bad neighborhood. It's a really, really, really good neighborhood. And
you can't afford it. Like,
you can't afford anything. And like the restaurants there are like fancier. They're more like niche, I guess.
And twice the price.
And forget about any kind of like residences.
Yeah, it's where the baseball player lives, and the NBA players, the Charlotte Hornets, is where they live.
Yeah.
Oh, and that's interesting that your earlier point too. You said, is this something happening everywhere? And you're telling me, yes, this is happening in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is a major city, but it's not a global city in the way that San Francisco is, where you have or maybe it is. I don't live in Charlotte. But I was in Durham last month, Durham, North Carolina, for a book reading, and the arts. I know in that area, I was hearing the same things you were telling me, that artists or other communities are really feeling the pinch of this massive influx of capital and investment and wealth, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in cities, but it comes with good and bad.
So I wonder if this is a natural, like, sociocultural phenomenon. Like, if you were able, just as an experiment, if you were able to take a specific population and they just decided to build up somewhere, even if it was in a random place, like say we decided that Milwaukee is going to be the next hub for our community. Like, I wonder if they would be able to establish themselves over the course of, say, one generation to the point where their property values would be worth so much more that they could actually establish themselves as a I don't know, financially secure community. I imagine if you took the immigrants coming over from the Middle East, or you know what, better yet, if the black community in America decided that we're going to make a Wall Street in Milwaukee. This is going to be the next hub. We're going to build banks. We're going to build grocery stores. This is going to be an art district. This is going to be a diamond district. This is where we're going to farm. Like, if they were a self-contained community and they built it up and they attracted businesses there and like they really built it up. I imagine that like 2 generations later, 3 generations later, like you would have Russians knocking on the door saying, "Hey, I'll offer you $4.5 million for your property," and then you'd sell, and then that's how you would get established. I wonder if, like, to look on the bright side of things, if you did establish yourself, if you did make roots in a place, if that could actually benefit you.
Well, I have no doubt what you described would happen if there was a certain population, whether it be artists or refugees or African Americans, that decided they were going to invest in a certain place and make it their own. That would happen, because what you're happening is you're making this place unique, you're making it special. And this is what we see happening. You know, I write about artist communities, that artists, you know, they sort of reinvent neighborhoods and make them interesting to outsiders, if you want to just simplify it like that. And what you're describing, I think, would have the same result, where, you know, people like to visit, for instance, ethnic communities, you know, Little Italy, Little Syria, Little Havana, because the food, they like the culture, they like the art, they like the music, so on and so forth. So I think if there was a project like what you described undertaken within, I don't think it would even take 2 generations. I think at the way the patterns we're seeing now would be much quicker. You would see real investment, whether it's Wall Street or foreign investment, as you said, knocking on the door saying, "Hey, can I buy the house here? Can I buy the business here?" And if you were the original investors that found that community, that would be great for you. But if you were, say, just the normal everyday citizen in those communities, you would probably not reap the financial rewards. But 2, I think what made the community interesting then would slowly disappear. And so how do you sort of combat that? I mean, one way, some communities I know are experimenting with communal land trusts, where the land itself is owned by a community nonprofit or some sort of structure. So if it's sold, it goes back into the community. So it can't be sold to outsiders. So that would be one way you could make sure the wealth stays within the community, set up a mechanism like that.
That sounds...
But that's a sort of a nascent sort of phenomenon right now. So I'm not sure what the long-term success or health of it would be, but that seems to be one policy idea that's floating around.
So not to make the issue like shallow or anything, but like I'm wondering, like, in simpler terms, so that I can wrap my head around this. Kind of seems like certain communities get bullied in the sense that, like, if they, like, in particular the arts community, maybe like they're artists, so by nature maybe not so much financially savvy, maybe not so much business savvy. Are these types of people getting like targeted or maybe bullied or taken advantage of, in the sense that, because you said that, like, at the people at 111 First Street, they were offered opportunities to like invest in other properties nearby, just not at that particular location. And maybe they weren't able to, or they didn't like that idea because they already lived somewhere. So it didn't sound reasonable. It didn't sound fair. How are they to start defending themselves to bring about their own
Sure.
permanency in the neighborhoods?
So I think you sort of helped answer the question yourself a little bit, and I detail this in the book as well, that a community that's targeted for or feels the brunt of gentrification, whether that be artists in the case of my book, Left Bank of the Hudson, or whether it's an ethnic community, a minority community, or working class community, is approach it with a degree of realism, understanding what is at stake, what sort of how political avenues are open to you, what legally is possible, what's financially possible. So in the case of 111 First Street, I was at an event about a month ago for the annual studio tour in Jersey City, and quite a few of the artists turned out to participate. And one artist rose his hand and he said, if I knew what I knew now, I would have spent more time trying to understand how real estate worked, how the state law worked, how the local law worked, instead of assuming that this would ultimately work out in my favor or someone else would take care of it, and instead of worrying about those issues, spending just time on my own art, on my own work, I would have actually tried to figure out how the system, works, whether that's the law or finances. And I think that's really the first step any group needs to accomplish, is figure out what are the forces, I guess, rallied around them or rallied against them, and how do you realistically confront them. So in the case of 111 First Street, the owner of the building, my understanding, and this is what I was able to gather through rumor and innuendo and discussions, is there were several points where the owner was offering the tenants buyouts, and substantial buyouts. And instead of taking the buyouts, the group sort of dug in their heels because they didn't want to leave their home, which is understandable. But if you approached it realistically, you would say, well, in the long run, we're probably not going to win this fight. So how about we try to get what we can as far as victory is concerned? Yeah. And again, that's sort of one lesson I would sort of say to take away from the story is, if you're in this similar situation, whether it's an arts community or any other community, is how do you maximize your leverage? Also, how do you build political bridges with other groups? Whether that be local housing activists with other groups, other neighborhoods, other communities within the greater area, to make sure you have a voice in this discussion of how the city is changing, because any city, any place is always changing. And how do you get a place at the table to control that change?
What about getting the government involved with maybe proposing policies that protected certain communities or cultural segments, or is that tiptoeing too close to like a socialist ideal?
No, I don't think so at all. I think, and you're seeing this happen now in more cities with, again, I mean, from really the post-World War II years up until the 1990s, people were leaving our cities for the suburbs. If people had a choice, they usually would leave. Or if they didn't have some sort of connection to the city, they would usually leave. So now, we're having this reinvestment and rebirth of our cities. So you mentioned, what's the one government policy tool? And I think the main thing governments can do is control zoning. So what you can build, how dense something can be, how high something can be. And the term is inclusionary zoning. So that is, if you're building a new apartment building or you're building a new community, a certain percentage of the housing has to be dedicated to affordable housing. Oh. And so what that percentage is, that can depend upon a different locality. What may work in one city, they might need 30%. Another city might need 10%. And that, I think, really is the main tool that a city can wield, is demanding in new construction inclusionary housing. And that at least allows a segment of the population to remain. Another tool is rent control. So this is a tool that hasn't really been used in many cities anymore. So rent can only go up a certain percentage every year, where most places it's purely at the whims of the market. So your rent could double in a year. It could go up 200% a year. And most people can't afford that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you know your rent's only going to go up 3% for the next 3 years, that's something you can predict.
Yeah, you can budget accordingly.
You can budget for it, right? If you know you need to make sure you have 3% more money next year, then you budget, or you know, maybe you try to work a few more hours, get a second job.
So where can people find your book?
Where can you find it?
Yes.
Yeah, where can people find your book? Is it on your website? Is it on Amazon?
It's available via Amazon. It's available via the website of my publisher, Fordham University Press. Really, any local bookstore, I'm sure they could order it for you. I've seen it in bookstores throughout New York and New Jersey. Also, my website, anothertownofthehudson.com. You can always contact me if you have any questions about the book via my website, or if someone's interested in just chatting about the book in general, I'm happy to do that.
Oh, I had one last weird question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Did you get any? Did you get any like negative pushback from people within the city, like maybe the Manhattaners?
When you say negative pushback from my book?
Yeah, just regarding because it sounds like you're crusading for not just the arts communities, but for fairness among people to live in a community that they established themselves in.
I think that is what I'm trying to do is a certain degree of equality for artists and for other communities. And did I get pushback?
Yeah.
For the most part, the audiences I've addressed, and I've given about 10 or 11 talks right now. I've talked in New York, in Jersey City, North Carolina, Minneapolis, Buffalo. Everyone who's attended seems very interested in arts or in cities or in keeping communities and cities that make them interesting. And you know, the certain pushback, I'd say the light pushback is the critique that not within my book or within many of these sort of stories about gentrification, there's a romanization of what cities were like before they became, I guess, engines of our economy again. Sort of underplaying what the element of crime that was in cities or poverty.
I got you.
And I think that's a valid nuance, but I haven't received any critiques necessarily about, well, this is anti-capitalist or this is un-American, if you will.
It seems kind of like on a good like rational, line of thought.
Cheers. All right, so you can go get the Left Bank of the Hudson on Amazon or on his website. And this is Polysex Podcast. This shows Anthony Lindsay
and Stephanie Marino.
Cheers.